My name is Lee Rock. I'm from Sheffield and convener of Sheffield Left, who played a role, obviously, in setting up the Sheffield Proto Branch, and also being a sponsor of your party. And Jim's going to get. Is that right? Yeah. So, you know, and a member of the Social Student Platform. We've got two speakers today. We've got Chris Saltmarsh, who's, let's have a look. Chris is Eco-Socialist Organising, who's author of a book on climate change, which hopefully you might plug, some excellent book. And we've got Tim Head from Organising for Popular Power. Now, Chris is going to speak for about 10 to 15 minutes. Tim says I'm going to speak for about 5 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions and contributions, which is the main part of the meeting. Thank you.
Thanks, Lee.
Powerful, eh?
A powerful start. Is this good? It's kind of business. Yeah, well, thanks very much for having me. I really appreciate it. Yeah, as Lee said, Chris Saltmarsh from the newly formed Eco-Socialist Organising, which is a kind of intervention we hope to make in your party to kind of advance eco-socialist politics in the first kind of period of its existence, but also hopefully over a longer period of time as well. To kind of raise an eco-socialist consciousness within the party membership and more widely, and also to shape its policy, programme, and strategy around the kind of crucial questions of the climate crisis in this conjunction. And so I'll just start by saying, you know, we kind of came to this intervention out of a recognition that I think there has been a general neglect of the climate crisis in your party debates, whether that's at the very top or whether it's among grassroots as well. I think this is particularly important because obviously about 6-7 years ago, climate crisis became a kind of zeitgeist issue that the left got involved with alongside a kind of insurgent climate movement. That climate movement fell away, it's disappeared. I won't go into the kind of ins and outs of the climate movement, but my view is that that climate movement is dead, it's not coming back, we shouldn't try to revive it. It's now our political imperative to try and forge a socialist and climate politics together, express that primarily through this party that we're building. I think as well it's also worth saying that for me, eco-socialism as a politics really makes a fundamental claim that building socialism is now at this juncture impossible without addressing climate and ecological crises, and that in turn addressing climate and ecological crises is impossible without kind of building socialist politics and socialist organisation. For me, that's quite obviously because I'm preaching to the choir here. Capitalist markets are demonstrably unable to do what's necessary in terms of, say, one core plank of climate transition is destroying an incredibly profitable industry, fossil fuels. But so too is reformism, social democracy, these kind of political approaches have also proven to be incapable of disciplining capital, abolishing certain fractions of capital on the time scale that is necessary to mitigate a kind of catastrophic climate situation. And so we're left with a socialist politics that, in our conception, has a kind of long-term horizon of socio-ecological transformation that reconciles the contradiction between production or accumulation in capital society and planetary limits. But in the short term, is able to actively take on this most pressing challenge of climate change. And so I think hopefully that kind of top-line politics will not be too controversial. What I want to kind of lay out is our, as Eco-Socialist Horizons, strategic kind of intervention that we hope to make, not necessarily at the founding conference, because we felt that the demands and the questions around having a democratic party were an important precondition for struggling over questions of climate. And so we've kind of got behind Socialist Unity Platform and democratic socialist demands and other demands that have sought to maximise the democracy of the party. We hope that votes kind of go that way. But the main intervention around the climate crisis and the politics and the strategy that flow from having this eco-socialist politics, these should be interventions that we all, I think, should come together and struggle over. And regardless of our kind of pre-existing kind of organisations we might be from, or pre-existing political or ideological or doctrinal positions, or whatever our position had been pre-founding conference, we hope that this politics of eco-socialism can be a unifying force for people right across the left in a recognition that the climate crisis is one of the primary contradictions that we face in capitalist society today, and resolving it or beginning to resolve it is a precondition for building socialism in general at all. And actually, that attacking the climate crisis is now a necessary constitutive part of socialist transition or socialist transformation in general. The reasons for that, it's really clear, I think, that although the climate crisis has not yet become what we might call catastrophe, its effects are intensifying, they're already with us. This is already happening, and we'll see it only intensify over the coming decades, that climate change as a process destroys the factors of production for capitalist society. So that might be land through the erosion of kind of agricultural land, labour, the kind of displacement and killing of people, and kind of fixed capital through the destruction of infrastructure or industry. And of course, this causes a crisis of capitalist accumulation. And as socialists, we might be forgiven for celebrating the kind of anti-accumulation tendency within the climate crisis. But I think it's important to be clear that this destruction of the factors of production for capitalist accumulation also undermines the future conditions of socialism. And we don't believe in building socialism on a dead or a dying planet or amid kind of capitalist catastrophe. We believe that we can only build socialism from a position where we have healthy land and a healthy population within ecological limits. And there's an important urgency, I think, to this climate crisis, and addressing the climate crisis that we're identifying. Because, as I say, we pass these planetary boundaries, because the tipping point kind of logic or nature of the climate crisis. There are certain planetary boundaries that if we pass, there's no going back from. And so it's not a case of kind of laying climate change for average capitalism and then bringing us back to the brink. Within our lifetime, and the lifetimes of anyone we could ever hope to know, a climate crisis really kind of locks us into irreversible changes that just make building socialism so much more difficult. And so the strategy that we kind of propose to bring into your party or whatever it ends up being called, hopefully a better name than it is before the populace this weekend, is a kind of two-pronged approach. And it's recognising that there's this kind of interplay between the urgent short-term necessity of rapid decarbonisation and then the long-term, not just ambition, but also necessity of transformation and moving beyond capitalism as a system. And so in this kind of near-term strategy, we identify a kind of like minimum basic political program, which is really revolved around instigating a rapid, almost kind of technical transition, recognising that the climate crisis is not purely kind of technical or technocratic challenge, it's obviously one of capitalist relations, but that there is some kind of technical dimension to it. And so there is a necessity to mobilise or leverage the state to discipline capitalist power and capitalist profits, to mobilise the socio-economic resources at its disposal to very rapidly arrest emissions and also to adapt to the warming that's already happening. Recognising that, as I said, it will become impossible for us to build socialism in a meaningful sense without first arresting this really rapid and imminently catastrophic ecological process. And what is the organising strategy that comes alongside this? Well, I think the urgency with which this limited transition needs to occur requires some critical engagement with the state. For us, this looks like using the party as a vehicle to contest elections at all levels, to shift the debate, to extract concessions, and or to exercise power through the state should we capture any of its institutions. This isn't because we fetishize the election or electoral work as a political tool or a tactic, but because in this moment we identify the state as a necessary political actor for socialists to work through or intervene in order to achieve this short-term, near-term goal of transition. We also recognise that that electoral work, we have to learn from the lessons, for example, of the failures of Corbynism, when this was a kind of purely electoral or primarily electoral project. It was not buttressed by building, to quote the name of my co-pass, popular power, where it relied on people to simply knock on doors without having a powerful labour movement, without having powerful social movements that would be able to put socialists in office, that would be able to defend them from attacks from the ruling class when they're in office, but also, crucially, would be able to hold those elected officials to account from our party working office as well. So there's this kind of necessary interplay between electoral work, but also building genuine power in communities and workplaces in the party. And so that near-term strategy, we'd argue, comes alongside this longer-term strategy, which still has our horizon, that's our name, on this eco-socialist transformation that we think ultimately is going to be necessary to reconcile the contradiction within capitalism between production, between accumulation, and planetary limits. Because simply decarbonising, simply destroying the fossil fuel industry obviously does not deal with all of the ecological breakdowns and catastrophes that capitalist society is giving to us. And so we think it's important that while articulating this kind of short-term, goal of disciplining capital to achieve a technical transition, we are also continuing to articulate the necessity for this transformation of socio-ecological relations to move beyond the capitalist mode of production, to democratise the economy, to enshrine ecology as an important principle in the planning of the economy. And obviously what this requires is not just having an electoral party with a hyper leader, as Charlie mentioned before, but to build a genuinely mass socialist party, but also a genuinely mass socialist party of kind that we've not seen before, one that has a genuine, deep-rooted, ecological, eco-socialist consciousness, and a culture of developing a political program, but also making strategic decisions that prioritize climate and ecological crisis. Recognize that there are some unique elements of the climate and ecological crises that need to inform our strategy. That these are things like urgency, things like recognizing that our strategy and our goals have to change as the climate changes in order, again, to effectively confront both the state and capital in relation to this kind of evolving, potentially imminently catastrophic crisis. And so I'm just going to finish by posing kind of three different questions, because I think one of the impulses behind our work and the intervention we want to continue to make over the coming months and years in your party, whoever ends up getting called, is that we feel like, some obligation to make this intervention as one of still a relatively small number of socialists who are committed to the question of ecology and really prioritise a combination between ecology and socialism. But at the same time, we recognise that confronting this crisis is laden with its own contradictions. There are not easy answers. The excruciating nature of being someone, as I have been, who is active on climate change throughout their political lives, is that there is no easy answer there to the question of what is to be done because of the contradictions that we face. And so I want to just raise three questions that I'm very interested in people's ideas about, because I don't think there are easy answers, and I think sharing our own ideas is going to be the only way we come to kind of better political and strategic prescriptions. That's firstly around temporality. There's a contradiction, I think, between the temporality of building a party, which through branches is very slow relational work, versus the urgency of confronting the primary contradiction around addressing climate change. Second point is around how central should climate change be to the party's political programme. I think it's very clear, I hope that those of us in the room, that climate change is an issue is quite possibly the most centrally, kind of civilizationally important of those that we face. But it's very clearly like not a popular issue for most moments in history. It was popular for maybe 18 months in the past 10 years. But it's clearly not a mobilizing issue in the way that, say, the cost of living might be, or even ownership of certain industries. And so how much do we narrate the centrality of climate change to our program versus having it in the background? And then finally, again, kind of reckoning with the challenges of this strategy of forcing climate concessions as a precondition for building socialism. I've made an argument that there's a necessity of engaging in electoral work immediately in order to obstruct those concessions, but it's obviously not clear that that'll be successful. We'll face the many challenges that socialists have always faced as we've sought to engage in or leverage the capitalist state. And so how exactly do we do that? How exactly do we extract kind of world historically significant concessions from the state on this urgent time frame while also building this mass socialist party? Thanks very much.
Sweet. Oh, okay. Hello. Okay, yeah, it's good to be here. Thanks for having us up on this now. I'll just Could you put your hand up if you have heard of this tendency for organising for popular power? So maybe I'll still explain just briefly what that tendency is, and then I'll sort of relate that a little bit to what's been spoken about already. I think, the first thing to say is that it's quite deliberately called a tendency and not an action, and I think that's good. I don't think that's just to make ourselves sound less nasty, but because actually there's so much of a shared platform with lots of different tendencies and groups that have emerged. There's lots of people in organising for popular power, but also members of the Democratic Bloc, the Democratic Socialists, your party, or kind of other groups as well. So what organising for popular power does as a tendency, it emphasises a particular thing as a priority, which is base building. So building deep and meaningful relationships within communities and organising people, politicising people, transforming working class agency, working class subjectivity, to build a kind of a strong and unified movement. And I think this is quite clearly in a lot of tension with some of the original ideas of your party, I suppose, is why that kind of tendency needed to emerge. It emerged probably in the run-up, to the World Transform Festival this year. There's a group of around 70 or 80 organisers who organise a range of issues and social movements across Palestine solidarity, in trans-feminist movements, anti-racist organising, within tenants unions, within rank and file trade union organising. And there was an attempt to come together to try and emphasise this priority within this new kind of emerging political moment. And I suppose in agreement with Eco-Socialist kind of platform there, would see things like elections as necessary, but definitely not as sufficient, essentially. And I suppose we'd be quite explicitly against electoralism, if you can call it that. So the kind of the sole focus on elections is the way to win power and enforce a kind of socialist or create a socialist society. So there's lots more I could say about it, but maybe if I just start to sort of link this a little bit to this panel. I think sort of maybe this is a controversial point. I don't think it is, but looking at the history of the climate movement, the kind of gains that have been made in the last 5 to 10 years. You could look at different ways, different strategies, I suppose. You could look at more of an electoral or electoralist strategy, I suppose, and a kind of movement grassroots organising strategy. It might be that like 2 or 3 Green MPs that got elected have got elected into Parliament in that time. You can kind of, I don't know, very proudly speak truth to power on backbenchers, etc., etc. So much organising capacity was sucked into making these very small wins there. It kind of shadows in comparison, I think, than I think a lot of people would think. When you compare it to kind of the effect of the mass movements, whether the school strikes, the movements that followed on from Extinction Rebellion, and all different kinds of more grassroots-led organising. And so I think that relates to the first point I want to make. I mean, there's 3 points I want to make, really. The first one is it's really important to think about this base building tendency when we think about how to win effectively. Secondly, perhaps more on a bleaker note, I think it's important to think about how we organise within the context of collapse, within the context of ecological collapse and societal collapse. And then, I don't know if this is a more optimistic point, but it's more optimistic because it's imagining there are some wins. But if we get these wins, how do we defend those wins? Okay, so first of all, I kind of mentioned already about this idea, a kind of theory of change that suggests if we want to actually win the demands that are being made, it's so necessary to have, as was mentioned before, that kind of powerful social base. You certainly can't rely on elected politicians to kind of honourably be true to their word, for one thing, but also to organise effectively within the state. I think, I could go on about that point more, but I think maybe the second 2 points are worth kind of focusing on a bit more. On the point of collapse, I mean, for me, so I have a very good friend who lives in North Carolina, Asheville, North Carolina, and just over a year ago, they had kind of the biggest storm of a generation. Thousands of people died. Many more than that lost their homes, were made homeless. They didn't have power, electricity, gas, fuel, running water, internet, Wi-Fi, whatever, communication, anywhere communicating, for upwards of 2 to 3 months. So my friend, her name's Kat, she, as far as she's concerned, she experienced the future. She experienced society collapse, what that looks like. So I don't think we can think of this anymore as a kind of distant possibility. These things are happening already around the world. They've been happening in the global south a lot, but they are increasingly happening in the global north. And it is a matter of time before it happens here and within Western Europe, for example. You've already had examples of it, but that's certainly not an if, but it's a when. Obviously, it's difficult because with a thing like climate, it's unpredictable. It's very, very unpredictable to know when these kind of things will happen. So you have to organise in a slightly more strategic way because you don't know when this thing's going to emerge. It's not like we've got an election in May 2026, so we know how to focus that, blah, blah, blah. But organising this popular power, this popular base, organising deeply within communities, building up unions and associations, speaking from my friend's experience, that has been the most powerful thing to organise within those contexts. A, it's useful, it meets people's needs and demands, and it kind of, to give a sliver of hope to this, I mean, North Carolina, this is a southern state. Asheville is somewhat liberal, or arguably quite neoliberal politics. But even so, it was surprising even to my friend Kat, how much kind of organic mutual aid style organising emerged out of necessity. And the kind of ways in which people innovate when they are met with these things in their everyday life. I think we need to be ready for these moments, and I think building popular power, whether that's through tenant union organising, through other kind of grassroots work, through the kind of solidarity work that we do, this stuff is not just, it is useful for all of these possibilities of collapse as well, and importantly, being able to play a role in kind of transformative politics within those moments, so that we can build kind of collective solidarity and not use the kind of shadow side of what can happen in these moments of collapse. And then the final point, I was mentioning about how to kind of defend wings as well. Also thinking about friends and comrades in the US, friends I have in New York. It's a very exciting time in lots of ways, with the election of Van Dam. But there is definitely, as they would put it, kind of slightly eerie feeling in the air of like knowing what is coming for them, and knowing what's coming for the kind of socialist politics that's being built up there. Every single successful revolution or revolutionary politics breeds intent counter-revolution. These things are kind of necessary as far as the historical record is concerned. And so we also have to be ready for what's coming for us when we're trying to defend the wins that we do have. And I think, again, that's something that has to be built now, has to be built immediately, these kind of connections, the kind of forms of social infrastructure that we are so lacking in our societies, that have been kind of hollowed out by decades of neoliberalism, for example. These are things that we need to start rebuilding now. And that's not because we're trying to just create a nice little kind of isolated commune-style societies for us to enjoy ourselves more. It's because this is going to be incredibly and increasingly necessary to defend what wins we do have. So that's how I would kind of connect this kind of base building tendency with the necessity of building that for a socialist horizon. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim. I'll open it to the floor now, so who wants to go? 1%.
Sorry to chip in again, but Mike Mayor, CPTV, in relation to Chris's point, two things. One, crisis is not the unhealth of capitalism, it's necessary to the health of capitalism. So there could be, I know this is contentious thing to say, there could be a successful green capitalism on the basis of the destruction of the military power and financial power of the United States of America. Just as there was a successful oil-based capitalism on the basis of the destruction of the coal-based power of the British Empire. And so it's not saying we don't need socialism, but the threat, in a sense, is as much of the geopolitics of the United States defending its oil-based supremacy, in particular in relation to the military form. There are no electric tanks or electric fighter aircraft or electric warships projecting power globally. And conversely, the policy which the United States has now clearly adopted in order to deal with the climate crisis is to deindustrialize excessively Russia and then China, and thereby reduce emissions outside the United States in order to maintain emissions within the United States. So the problem essentially, the problem of war and the problem of ecology pose themselves as identical. The issue which goes along with that, our alternative in relation to the state power, it's almost certainly illusory to imagine that even if we won a British general election with an enormous majority, and in respect to the other comrade's point, with a very large base, etc., nonetheless, actually, we would be strangled by, in the same way as the Syriza government was strangled by the Troika, we too would be strangled by the Troika. So our project needs to be a European-wide project, not just an eco-socialist project. Second, in relation to base building, this stuff that has been debated in the United States, and I think the base building tendencies in the United States have very much lost momentum. And the reason why they've very much lost momentum is that it's not that it's not a good idea to build bases. It's not that it's not a good idea to do tenants organising as well as trade union organising, as well as building cooperatives. All of these things are fundamental. But the problem is that the state power, in the form of the judiciary, but also of the legislature, intervenes to take control of these initiatives and bring it back under subordination, so that you need an anti-constitutional politics to back up the base building. The SPD in pre-1914 Germany is able to build big bases because it was quite an outlaw party. The PCI in Italy in the 1950s and 60s, similarly, because it was an outlaw party and not part of the coalition regime, could build bases. So, just those are just points in relation to the points that comrades have made, which I hope will something.
Thank you, Mike. Can you pass it back to Alan?
Alan Gibson from the Bolshevik Tendency, and I'm a supporter of the Marxist Bulletin tendency inside your party. Two central points from the speakers, which I think are mistaken. Firstly, the first speaker was talking about the need for a strategic approach of trying to arresting the collapse by putting pressure on or using the capitalist state as a necessary precondition for, I think that's the term you used, for building a socialist alternative in the future. And the other one is the emphasis on base building and the importance that can give in terms of mutual aid when the increasing results of ecological collapse started impacting on people and society. And that's only going to increase because all the parameters of ecological collapse are continuing in a negative direction. Increasingly so, and tipping points are being passed as we speak. I have a problem with the first perspective of, which is the kind of perspective of the Green New Deal, or the radical Green New Deal, that because of the urgency of the crisis, the struggle for socialism or communism or the end of capitalism needs to be either seen as a second stage or something that is put on hold somewhat for this more urgent immediate strategy of reforming capitalism. I know you don't use that term, but using levers to put pressure on capitalism. Andreas Malm actually puts this most concretely because he talks the need for a revolution, but then in practical terms comes out and says we've got to use what we have, which is the capitalist state. And I think that misunderstands the reality of capitalism, some of the stuff that Mike was talking about. The reality of capitalism is completely tied in its vast majority to the processes which are causing the ecological collapse. The way that we produce food, the way that we produce energy. These are all tied up in how capitalism works. The vast amounts of money which are involved in investing in those processes. So the idea that we could stop this behemoth to turn things around has been behind the ecological movement for the last, let's look at the COPs. That was what the COPs were there to do. And yet all the graphs are like that. It's all getting worse. The capitalism as a social structure built around short-term profitability, eternal growth, is something which it cannot, I think, inherently deal with the ecological collapse, which is something which is beyond us. By the time it becomes something which everybody on the planet recognises as our main problem, it will be too late because so many tipping points have been passed. So I think that it's a danger to present as a strategy presenting some kind of necessary alliance with the progressive capitalists. Because who else is going to be the levers within capitalism who brings us around, or building mass movements which can bring about little reforms. We need a fundamental transformation of society, I think. And so that for eco-socialism, I think that the urgency means that it's more urgent for us to put to front and centre the need to overthrow capitalism. There's no future for humanity without overthrowing capitalism. Not this idea of a two-stage. First, we'll use capitalism to mitigate the worst excesses, and then socialism will have a better playing field on which to grow. It's simply not going to happen. And the problem with base building is similar. I'll finish. It's kind of the idea that Mike was talking about, the question of the state. Yes, mutual aid is very important. It will be useful for mitigating against the chaos which ecological collapse is going to bring, but it doesn't deal with. It's like ambulances at the bottom of the cliff. And yes, ambulances at the bottom of the cliff are very useful, but we need to get rid of the cliff. And it's a question of what's the important thing to do, because that cliff is only getting higher and higher, and the ambulances at the bottom are becoming less and less effective. We've got to overthrow capitalism. That's the only solution to prevent the horror that is going.
Comrade in the grey. It's coming.
Sorry, who? Where? Sorry. I'm Jessica from Anti-Capitalist Resistance and the Eco-Socialist Action Network. Thank you very much for the talks. I think it's interesting what's been said about organising around popular issues and the difficulty sometimes of doing that with climate issues that can seem quite abstract. However, I think it's important that we look at issues that might not immediately appear like climate issues, but in fact are very much climate issues, like food prices, like transport, like insurance premiums. I mean, a lot of the time, when you own a house or rent a house in a floodplain or anywhere which is going to be affected by extreme weather events, these are all climate issues, and they're also issues that people deal with every single day. These are things that people don't have money for, people don't have savings for. They're also climate issues. I was in Belgium recently speaking to comrades there about Code Red, which is a very successful climate movement in Europe that I think we can look to in terms of practical on-the-ground organising. Although they do direct action, which is not necessarily what your party is about, it does use a lot of tactics that I think we would also benefit from, which is linking up unions, the people who work in the places like the energy companies, the local communities around specific local issues, and that's quite a good way of galvanising communities and making it about something that it's not abstract. They have the great slogan, the end of the world, the end of the month, the same fight, because they don't have enough money to get to the end of the month, and we're fighting against the end of the world. And the people who are making it impossible to pay rent are the same people who are, polluting and causing climate change. It's all the same people. The same people who are pushing up insurance premiums are the same ones that are investing in fossil fuels. So making those links and drawing them all together, I think is key. And so, yeah, I think looking at those kind of global struggles, also in Brazil, is another really good example of where they have been able to bring together issues around colonialism, indigenous rights, and also deforestation and big agriculture. I mean, obviously, different arguments happen in different ways in different countries, and so it's finding out what the issues are that matter to people on the ground, and then organising around those would be the best tactic, in my opinion.
Thank you. Simon.
So, okay, Simon Hanna, also from Anti-Capitalist Resistance. Thank you for the talks. I guess just following on from the point Jessica was making, that finding ways to bring the climate crisis in with the social crisis is absolutely essential. I know the French movement, I'm going to mangle this slogan now, but they have a thing where they say,
End of the month, the end of the world.
Yeah, the end of the month, the end of the world is caused by the same people, i.e., your wages don't get to the end of the month, you can't afford the things you need, the end of the world is also coming, it's the capitalist class is the problem, and so it has to be, and so it's an appeal for a kind of, which was better in the original French, it's an appeal for a class struggle campaign which isn't just talking about the climate, but kind of the abstract, as Jessica said, but is rooting it in the, in the fight over wages and people's living standards. And I think, one of the best things your party can fight for is a 4-day week. That's a very clear, I think it's an eco-socialist demand. We're reducing energy usage, we're reducing, wasting time doing bullshit jobs, as David Graeber called them. That helps with all the energy use. It also gives people a better quality of life. There's ways that we can really make these things spark and come alive for people, so that it's not just sort of talking about it, in a way that something is happening in another country or it's happening in the future or something like this. I guess just on the point that Chris made, kind of from a kind of Green New Deal kind of argument. I mean, in as much as every fight that socialists have is a demand on the bourgeoisie, and therefore you can use the state for that. You can win a majority in Parliament. You can use legislature to try and offset the carbon crisis. I mean, one of the things you could do in Parliament is you could pass legislation to we could just stop the subsidies to the fossil fuel companies. There's real practical reforms that you could get through Parliament So I don't think that there's just a kind of reform versus revolution dichotomy that is that useful in this conversation. But obviously we do have to have a deeper, more serious discussion about the way that the capitalist state is embedded in the economy. It's not neutral, it's not separate from the productive forces and the relations of production, and therefore to what extent could even a quite radical legislative reform programme by your party government alliance with the Greens or whoever, like how far could that really get? And I think that's sort of something that we need to really think about. And I know there's debates around the limitations of the Green New Deal strategy and so on. I don't think it's that helpful just to say, oh, that's just reformist, that's not going to work. We have to think about how some aspects of the Green New Deal programme, as Mark said in the Communist Manifesto, can make despotic inroads into private property. It can pose the question through transition funds, which actually, challenge the nature of ownership of the economy and so on. But obviously, it's not going to go far enough. We can't use Parliament just to legislate for socialism, and that is where we do need a more revolutionary strategy to think about coming out of it in terms of actually challenging the social, political, economic relations in society in a much more revolutionary way, which does mean, I think elements of base building is fine. I think it also involves being much more proactive with workers occupying their workplace. All the old stuff we used to do back in the day. Like bringing some of these things back and actually kind of making people feel empowered. And if your party can be part of bringing back that kind of tradition of working class struggle from below, then I think that would be a really positive thing. But yeah, I guess there's lots of things to think about in terms of the actual practical application of the strategy and the kind of at what point the revolutionary horizon of the climate crisis really, impacts in a way that it becomes an actual revolutionary crisis.
Well, that might come in the cap.
Yeah, thanks. I think I probably disagree with the perspective that everything has to be about the overthrow of capitalism and things like eco-socialism have to wait. I think it's incredibly relevant in two distinct ways. One is internationally and one is locally. Internationally, I'm not sure about the argument we heard about 10 minutes ago about America running down, being quite happy to assist Russia and China in decarbonising so that it can retain the monopoly of fossil fuel dependent energy resources. I think the reality is that China in particular is planting huge solar fields all over Africa. And I recently returned from Cuba and they're doing the same there, which is a directly anti-imperialist thing to do, because Trump and Marco Rubio are ratcheting up the embargo on Cuba to the extent that in any town or city you can see the energy outages, the lights go out completely, the air conditioning goes out completely, and only those places with their own generators can stay functioning. And that's the reality in much of the world. On the local level, I give you the example of Lancashire, where arguably Lancashire has been at the forefront of the anti-fracking movement. Some long and bitter struggles have been fought in Lancashire, and the contradiction between that experience, that reality, that deeply embedded feeling within local, county-wide public opinion, ran straight into the fact that reform grabbed control of Lancashire County Council. Since when reform has struggled massively to actually deal with the reality of the fact that public opinion is strongly against fracking, and reform's policy is to frack. And various councillors have had to resign reform councillors have had to resign because of the contradiction between their political careerism on the one hand and reforms policies on the other. So it does work out. There are places and there are situations when local struggle, local working class struggle is very much involved in these issues, and certainly internationally links into internationalism, and even more manifestly than you can't have socialism in one country, you cannot have eco-socialism in one country. It's really obvious. The world is an integrated ecosystem, and these issues have to be taken forward within your party very strongly, particularly if we're going to be able to relate to young people. I know both of my sons are strongly involved in ecological issues, and a lot of young people are, or if they're not, they feel these issues very deeply. And I think some of us who are considerably longer in the tooth don't necessarily understand that.
It's John, isn't it? Is it John?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Cheers. Hopefully not repeating too much that was already said by the comrades from Anti-Capitalist Resistance. But by the way, my name's Ted, I'm part of the SYP. But a good point to make to people in trying to relate to the cost of living is obviously the scarcer resources get, the more expensive things get, and with the destruction of soil and whatnot, prices go up as a result. And also fossil fuel subsidies are going up every year worldwide, because it's getting more expensive to get oil out of the ground, because we're having to dig deeper and deeper. And I think that's a good point to make to people. The deeper we have to dig, the more it costs money to actually get it out of the ground, the more unprofitable it is, and therefore people's taxes go up to subsidise fossil fuel extraction. And if there's anything that most people in this country don't like, it's their taxes going up. So that's a good point to make. I agree that communism is ultimately what will save the planet, if we are to save it, because capitalism responds to destruction, and destruction can help capital accumulation because it clears the way for a new round of accumulation. And the destruction of capital in turn generates that more aggressive streak in the capitalist class to therefore accelerate the commodification of nature. So that instigates the class struggle and the economic struggle and all the rest of it. But reformism can be part of the struggle for revolution, absolutely. You know, it's all just a process. It's all a process, and revolution is like a culmination of evolutionary processes, ultimately. So we kind of have to, like someone else said, you do have to kind of, there is a balance. You can't like completely rule out reformism. It sort of goes back to Rosa Luxemburg's reform revolution. It's both in the end. And yeah, I mean, it's hard to talk to people more widely about things in terms of what is being studied technologically, but it's just really interesting that a lot of like the most advanced technologies that are being studied at the moment are what I consider to be socialist technology, because it's just not profitable to sort of build them at scale. Things like, I don't know if you've heard of like precision fermentation, where the claim is that you can create chemically identical foods that traditional farming can produce, but at a fraction of the resources and cost. But it's just never going to be profitable, to build a scale. There's, in 2019, there are reports of like what they were calling a mycelium revolution, where in labs you can grow like almost anything you can think of out of mycelium, which is like obviously a type of fungi. And obviously I don't know if that's true or not, because I'm not a scientist and I haven't been privy to those studies. But again, if you to do that at scale, because there's no exploitation of labour involved, because it just grows itself, like it's almost programmable. Like a lot of these new technologies are programmable and automated, but capitalism just can't achieve these new innovations at scale. So again, obviously that sort of thing's a bit harder to communicate at the wider scale, but in terms of those of us who are reaching more advanced levels, it's certainly something we should be conscious of.
Thanks. Can you have the microphone back? You sum up now. Answer responses. You want to go first, Ted?
Yeah, well, I won't be able to speak to everything, I guess, but yeah, thanks for some of those comments. They were really helpful for me to think about. I think, yeah, maybe firstly, quickly on some of the points that just been mentioned about, we have this dilemma, which is that climate politics is not, at the moment, a popular issue with voters when they're polled, essentially, which I think is undeniably true. I think that the framing of that logic of that framing, I think itself comes from a kind of electoralism that I do think we should challenge. I think we should probably do. I do think this leads to a lot of popular power. That's my own personal opinion. But I think we can, instead of thinking just about that model of like you're going door knocking, you're on a doorstep, and you're trying to persuade someone to vote for your party with an eco-socialist agenda, and you're presented with the fact that this person doesn't care about that, and you say, okay, well, let's try and figure out a way to make this relevant to something in that kind of one conversation. The Organising for Popular Power model deliberately tries to get away from just those isolated conversations and actually tries to build popular power, which means relationships and building organisers, building leaders organically, so that people will come on a journey of transformation, I suppose. I think something like being politicised in kind of politics does require a certain level of political education. It requires a certain level of yeah, it requires a certain level of education, political education. Once people are politically educated about these things, they do tend to care about them a lot. Especially if you're a younger person and you're aware of the fact that this is going to massively impact your life. There's not a more obvious form of self-interest there, really. But it just does take that level of deep political education. We can't just think of it as like, how can we just win over voters in the next election or on the doorstep, etc. So I think that's something where the Organising for Popular Power may just offers a slight complicating of the way we often frame these problems. I think I also agree with the points that have been made about being careful about getting pushed into these kind of these false dichotomies of reform versus revolution, of engaging with the state and not engaging with the state, of overthrowing capitalism or driving an ambulance to stop someone from dying. I don't think it makes sense to put ourselves into these dichotomies and say, how can you possibly do one whilst needing to do the other? For a whole bunch of quite obvious reasons. And again, it comes back to what I was saying about our tendency being a tendency within this. We're not saying that everyone has to do exactly what we're doing, but there should be a role for it. I think these kind of debates make a lot of sense if we're doing an abstract academic debate and we're trying to win arguments in a room. But I think if you're actually doing organising in communities on the street, there is no world of moral purity left for you to be like, okay, well, this is just finally resolve that debate once and for all. Those debates won't get resolved. In this space, it might feel like we've won an argument, but that's not the reality. The reality is always so much more messy. And I think that's another reason why a basic living approach is good, because it forces you into those contradictions. Gets you out of trying to win arguments with other leftists in the room, which we can all get to. And I think we're thinking here about the role of the party, the role of your party as well, and the role of this weekend. There's an article that I really, really liked by Salah Mohammedesi. It was actually written quite a long time ago, relatively speaking, written in 2020, called, I think it's called The Party is Articulated and Viewpoint Magazine. I really recommend reading it. And it's essentially talking about the potential of a party as a way to bring together different social struggles. And that without having some kind of infrastructure, it can be difficult to politicise and change a range of issues. And when we think about something like the climate becoming sort of like no longer part of this platform, unless you have actual organisers who are involved in both struggles, or at least talking to one another, it's very easy for that kind of that siloing to happen. I look at a lot of people that came to this weekend with a lot of cynicism and a lot of anger even about how this process has gone since the Labour Party. This article gave me a lot of focus on thinking about the potential of our classic greatness living together. And then just last of all, actually no, that's fine. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thanks everyone for really interesting and challenging comments. Yeah, really appreciate them all. I think, for maybe as more of a kind of general comment I'd start with, I'd say, I think for me it is important that while we retain a socialist analysis of the climate crisis, of strategy, of transition, we also almost embrace an uncertainty of how we get out of this mess. And kind of to restate one of the first points I made, I don't think it is clear that you simply do this. You know, I'm not trying to say you simply elect a socialist government in the UK and then you decarbonise and somehow there's a contagion effect and you decarbonise globally. Like, it's not clear that that's going to happen, but it's also not clear, I think, that there is a kind of like revolutionary route to this either. You know, I think the comrade at the back, whose points I think were very compelling, kind of made this argument that kind of doing transition without overthrowing capitalism simply isn't going to happen. One could quite, easily or equally contend overthrowing capitalism is also simply not going to happen. Unfortunately, we do not. I don't think my assessment is we do not live in a conjuncture where that rupture, that revolution, is imminent. And so I think what I'm trying to think through, what we're trying to think through, is not a kind of stagist strategy. But thinking about eco-socialist transition as a process, in which we might think it might be productive to think about the sequencing by which we go after different sections of capital. And for me, I think the provocation, there's been a kind of, I think, a not unreasonable characterization of my argument as kind of in this like radical Green New Deal vein. That's clearly the political tradition that I have come from in recent years. But I've been thinking about it in a more kind of like post-Green New Deal sense. So it's like, yes, I'm not kind of completely rejecting that approach of kind of seeking to use the capitalist state in some way to accelerate this transition, but also recognizing that we probably do need to move beyond the kind of idea that we could form some kind of temporary alliance with the green sections of capital. Instead, thinking about a much more agitational approach where we are really actually foregrounding the necessity of destroying a fraction of capital. So it's not about saying we're just kind of going to make friends with the capitalist state. It's going to say we're going to use all that we have to mobilize its institutions in order to identify the fossil fuel industry as the first one that needs to go. And so the kind of technical argument about transition informs that question of sequencing. And I think this relates to the comments from the comrades from anti-capitalist resistance, which are very welcome and really agreeable, which is, I think, yeah, we can make this kind of argument. We can identify these everyday issues and clearly have a climate dimension, even if it doesn't feel foregrounded. I love the end of the world, end of the month, same fight slogan. It's brilliant. I think one of the things we can start to do is, like, when we're talking about energy, or when we're talking about food prices, when we're talking about insurance, attaching those kind of bread and butter demands to a kind of top level demand, which is, and we need to destroy the fossil fuel industry. And I think as eco-socialists, as the climate movement, we've not, I think, there's often a debate between, do you have this very maximalist politics or do you have this very like micro politics? I think there's an absolute necessity to bring them together and bring the bread and butter in with the kind of, Malm talks about revolutionary mitigation. I think there's a kind of, there's something in that with kind of being comfortable with the contradiction of like, yes, we need to do this quite technical thing of mitigation, but we need to do it in as close to a revolutionary way as possible. And so yeah, just the thing I'll finish by saying is, yeah, I appreciate this conversation. I think we could have this conversation for many hours. I hope that whether it's within Eco-Socialist Horizon or Eco-Socialist Horizon with other comrades and other organisations, we can all continue to embrace this really difficult discussion of what do we do about the climate crisis as socialists through the party as an institution. I think the party, for all of the fuckery that we've had over the past few weeks and this weekend, if it exists in the next few days, will be a vehicle through which we can collectively work through this most difficult question that I think as socialists we probably have ever faced.